Good afternoon, OPS. Can you believe it's Friday already? So every day at 1 o'clock, we've been meeting and sharing some books together. And so today, we're going to share our last book for the week, and it is called The Day-Glo Brothers. Now, remember the last books that I read, like 21 Elephants or even Mighty Jackie the Strikeout Queen? I told you I found those in the fiction section, which means they were based on true events. However, they also had some made-up stuff, some stuff we couldn't prove if it was factual or not. Today's book is not like that. I found this book in the biography section of the library, and it is the biography of two boys who accidentally invented something pretty exciting. So today we are going to read The Day-Glo Brothers. And if you don't know what Day-Glo is, look at that yellow and that green. I tried to match it today with my clothes. Those are Day-Glo colors, as is the orange there. We see them a lot, and sometimes we call them fluorescent colors too. The Day-Glo Brothers, the true story of Bob and Joe Switzer's bright ideas and brand new colors. Well, that's a great subtitle, isn't it? They're bright ideas, because those are some very bright colors. Even if they'd wanted to, the ancient Egyptians couldn't have painted their pyramids a green that glowed in the desert sun back in 2000 BCE. There was no such color. A glowing orange Statue of Liberty might have made coming to America even more memorable. But when Lady Liberty was assembled in 1886, that color wasn't an option. And in 1820, if young Bob and Joe Switzer had thought their family's Montana cottage would look better with a yellow glow, they would have been out of luck too. But not for long. After all, it was the Switzer brothers themselves who would soon bring those eye-popping yellows, oranges, and greens into the world. It would just take a few bright ideas. The Switzer brothers' illuminating tale begins with Bob, born in 1914. From early on, Bob loved to work. He earned money shoveling snow, picking beets, and using a souped-up Model T Ford, that's a car, to round up wild horses. Bob wasn't just a worker, he was a planner. One summer, he saved his money to pay for a ride in an open cockpit of a stunt plane at the fair in Billings, Montana. So there we see the older Switzer brother, and he saved up all of his money to go into a special open cockpit plane so his head was out in the air. Now let's learn a little bit about his little brother, Joe. Joe, younger by 15 months, exerted himself a lot less than his older brother. Practicing magic tricks was more his speed. With his knack for sleight of hand, he made metal rings and playing cards seem to disappear and reappear. Joe also had a problem-solving streak. His dad had kill watch for customers coming in. So see that mirror? So his dad could lie down and look up at that mirror, and it was pointing towards the door, and he would know when someone came in. So I'm starting to get some ideas about the Switzer brothers. Bob, he's the hard worker. Joe, he's the idea guy. He comes up with all the ideas. A long drought brought hard times to Montana. So in 1931, the family moved to Berkeley, California, where Mr. Switzer had bought a pharmacy. In Berkeley, Joe began wowing crowds with magic shows at schools and churches. His acts included a kind of illusion called black art. Black art involved objects painted half black and half white. They seemed to float and disappear when held under a spotlight. It was a nifty trick, but Joe wished he could make his magic trick even better. Remember, Joe's our idea guy. While Joe was set on showbiz, Bob wanted to be a doctor. Doctors made good money, he reckoned, and like pharmacists, they helped people to be healthy. After graduating from high school in 1932, Bob won a scholarship to a university near home. In 1933, Bob took a summer job on a railroad car. One day, when Bob was climbing into a car full of ketchup bottles, the barricade he was standing on collapsed, and Bob fell about 12 feet and hit his head. The fall gave Bob lots of medical issues, and it hurt his eyesight. It also damaged his memory, which meant he couldn't become a doctor anymore. Bob had to spend several months in his basement in the dark. So Bob's wanted to be a doctor, and now he can't, so he's going to have to come up with a new plan. So Joe was down there too, but for a different reason. He was in the dark so he could think about light. Joe had read in a magazine about ultraviolet lamps, also called black lights, which made certain substances glow in the dark. Joe knew this glow, called fluorescents, could jazz up his magic act, and the basement seemed like the perfect place to experiment. Bob was bored, so he was willing to help his little brother Joe. So, we got that new word called fluorescents, and that tells us that things glow in the dark. And we also had a new word called ultraviolet light. Have you ever seen a purple light like that? That when you put certain things under it, they actually glow in the dark. There are actually even rocks that glow in the dark when you put them under an ultraviolet light. Together, the brothers built their own ultraviolet lamp. One night, they took it to their dad's drugstore. In the darkened storeroom, they aimed the light at the bottles and boxes on the shelves. There in the dark, the chemical stain label on a bottle of eye wash emitted a yellow glow. That glow lit up the Switzers' imaginations. They brought home lots of books from the library and began learning how to use chemicals to make glow-in-the-dark paints. In regular light, they looked plain, but under that special ultraviolet light, they radiated. That means they shone bright, attention-getting colors. Bob thought they could use the paints for more than just Joe's magic act. They could sell it for use in store-wide displays and make a little money to cover Bob's medical bills. So see the brothers, they're working together right now. Bob and Joe scrounged around the university and other local labs for additional phosphorescent materials. When they got hold of some, say urane or anthracene, they ground them up. Then they secretly used their mother's new kitchen mixer to combine the powder with alcohol, shellac, or other ingredients. So they're trying to make their own paints that would glow in the dark. The results? Splattering, gooey, glowing paints. And once, when Mrs. Switzer surprised them before they could clean the paint out of a mixer, an angel food cake that was that color. So you see, everything is starting. You see it over here in the illustration too. They were using their mom's mixing bowl to make the paint. And the paints they were making were starting to be phosphorescent. But Bob and Joe had a bigger problem, the sun. The effect of ultraviolet light was impossible to be seen in daylight. Plus, the sunlight faded the paints so they wouldn't glow at night either. So much for Bob and Joe using their paints on store windows. While they were wrong about that idea, Joe was right about how fluorescence could boost his magic act. It was a gruesome effect, but when it won first prize at a magician's convention and made the newspaper, word got around, and soon Bob and Joe had lots of customers. So look, he painted in his magic act. He painted a head orange, yellow, and her body yellow. So when he took off the mask, it looked like she had no head because this part was all in the dark. The war-filled theater bought fluorescent costumes that made chorus girls look like wriggling skeletons. The toy department at Hale Brothers featured a glow-in-the-dark Christmas display. Spiritualists used the brothers' paint to trick customers into thinking they were seeing ghosts on the walls. A printer in Cleveland, Ohio, began using the Switzer Boys fluorescent ink to make posters for movie theaters. Like the rest of Joe and Bob's creations, the ink in those posters was used mostly inside and glowed only under that special ultraviolet light. You know, last year at our talent show, we had an act that was just like this. They put glow sticks on them, and when the lights were turned off, only parts of them glowed. But one day in May 1935, while Joe was away drumming up more business, Bob made a discovery. He dipped some silk fabric samples in a boiling combination of alcohol and fluorescent dye. Then he hung the samples in the backyard to see whether sunlight would fade. A little while later, Bob was in the front yard when something caught his eye. Even at the distance and in ordinary daylight, he could see that the fabric in the backyard was glowing. What had caused it? The alcohol? The dye? The boiling? The silk? Bob didn't know, and with a million things on their minds, he and Joe didn't have time to figure out the answer. Not right away, anyway. So it sounds like a lot of what Bob and Joe did happened by accident. So they happened to be in Dad's drugstore and noticed that one of the chemicals lit up. And then when they were in the backyard, he happened to put something in the boiling, and all of a sudden the material was glowing in the dark too. Soon the brothers decided to focus on their biggest customers back east and leave Berkeley behind. With new suits, $90, and a back seat full of fluorescent inks and paints, Bob and Joe drove off to Ohio on New Year's Day in 1936. There they settled in Cleveland and earned a living by providing colors for fluorescent posters. But they kept chasing after better colors and new ideas, each brother in his own way. Bob was a morning person, and Joe liked the night. Joe might wrap up his work and hit the hay, and not before long, Bob awoke to begin his research. Bob focused on specific goals, while Joe let his freewheeling mind roam every which way when he tried to solve a problem. If just one experiment out of 1,000 succeeds, Joe would say, then you're ahead of the game. And isn't that true? If you keep trying and just that one time it works, well, you're still ahead. For Bob and Joe, the tough times of the Great Depression meant living and experimenting on the cheap. When Bob got married, his wife moved into the apartment the brothers were sharing. Patricia let Bob borrow her shiny satin wedding dress, and that was the last time she saw it in one piece. So what did he do to the dress? He cut parts of it and he started to dye it. After Joe got married in 1938, he and his wife Elise moved into a rundown old farmhouse so he would have room for his own laboratory. It wasn't the best place for a young family, as their baby boy liked to chew on chemical-splattered shoes. But Bob and Joe's efforts paid off brilliantly. One day they drove out in the city of Sandusky to check on a new billboard they had developed. Instead of using ink, they had soaked the billboard's fabric panels with a combination of fluorescent orange dye and hot alcohol. If the dye didn't fade too quickly, the ultraviolet lamps on the billboard would make for an eye-grabbing nighttime display. When the billboard came into view that afternoon, What the brothers saw astonished them. For more than a mile away, it looked like the billboard was on fire. When they got up close, the Switzers didn't find any flames. Instead, they discovered something even more exciting. It was just like those silk samples Bob had seen in the backyard. Even without the ultraviolet light on the billboard, it was glowing bright orange in the orange sun. Okay, so I have an idea. I remember that when they made that satin in the backyard, they had alcohol. And when they made this special panel, they also had alcohol. So I wonder if alcohol was the special ingredient to make it glow. By accident, Joe and Bob had invented a totally new color. To their amusement, it glowed in both daylight and ultraviolet light. They called this new color fire orange, and Joe used their newfound know-how to create other colors, glowing reds, yellows, greens, and more. Meanwhile, Bob looked for ways these Day-Glo colors could be used. World War II provided lots of them. You know what I really like about this book is how they're starting to use more colors, and the illustrations on the pages show more colors then. Day-Glo fabric panels were used to send signals from the ground that could easily be seen by airplanes 10,000 feet in the air. So they could use a piece of material on the ground, and all the way up in the sky, an airplane could see it. Survivors of disasters at sea used the panels in lifeboats to improve the chance of getting rescued. So if somebody was in a lifeboat, if they used these colors, somebody far away could see them. Day-Glo buoys marked areas in the water that had been cleared of floating explosives. Aircraft crews clad in Day-Glo suits lit by ultraviolet lamps guided planes to nighttime landings. In small but certain ways, the Switzers' inventions helped the United States and its allies win the war. After the war, Bob and Joe's colors made them rich. Day-Glo began to brighten everyday life back home. The colors made their way onto gas station signs and detergent boxes, traffic cones and magazine covers, including Joe's old favorite popular signs. Artist Andy Warhol used them in his famous paintings for life jackets, from life jackets to dump trucks, golf balls to goalposts, hula hoops to hunting vests. Joe and Bob's creations kept glowing and glowing. And I bet if you think right now of all the different places that you've seen Day-Glo, sometimes it's in a shirt, sometimes it's in a sign, even sometimes balls are painted with it now. When they were growing up, Bob and Joe Switzer wanted different things. Bob wanted to make his fortune becoming a doctor, and Joe wanted to make his mark on the world through magic. At first, it may seem that neither brother ended up where he wanted to, but in the darkened basement, the Switzer brothers began to look at the world in a different light. One brother wanted to save lives. The other brother wanted to dazzle crowds. With Day-Glo, they both did. So how does regular fluorescence work? Sunlight is made up of colors ranging from red to violet. These colors combine to make white light. And when white light hits an object, some of the colors are absorbed and some are reflected. In the case of, say, an orange, the color orange is reflected, and that's the color people see. What I really liked, this book also has an author's note, and one of the things I think you've learned about me is that I really love books that have author's notes in it. So the author of this book, Chris Barton, he writes, I have seen Day-Glo colors my whole life, but I had never considered how those colors came to be until Bob Switzer died in 1997, and I read his obituary in the New York Times. That article introduced me to Bob and Joe Switzer. The story stuck with me, and when I began writing for children a few years later, it was one of the first ones I wanted to tell, but I needed more information, so I had to start researching. See, that's how authors get their ideas all the time. They see something or they read something, and all of a sudden they say to themselves, this could be a really good story. And when they do that, then they might have to start doing research. So while you're home right now, make sure you're looking around and you're listening to your family tell stories. You could even ask somebody to tell you a story about when they were young, because maybe that will be the story that you write in a book that gets published and makes you famous. So have a great weekend, and I can't wait to hear about everything you did over your week when we start school again on Monday.